Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2016 Nonprofit Leadership Development Brown Bag Series here on February 18th. Today, we are going to be talking about good governance. So very excited to have you here with us today, and we'll go ahead and get started as people continue to log on to the webinar. As we wait for them, we'll prepare for our time together. So would encourage you to close the door to those outside distractions. If you're able, physically get up and close those conference room doors or that office door so that you won't be interrupted or distracted by things going on outside. Also encourage you to silence your electronic devices, that opportunity to focus on being present with the content here today, and also if you are joining with the group, to not distract others with those phones and laptops. Also would encourage you to turn off all of the other applications on your computer, knowing that we have the email notifications and beeps and buzzes that can draw us into other things. Encourage you to really invest your time here today with the content that we have on good governance and looking at that through a leadership lens. And of course, since we're going to be together through the computer for the next 55 minutes or so, get comfortable in your surroundings. Kick off your feet, sit back in your chair, stand up, move around, whatever you need to do to best learn and take in the information. And also would encourage you to reflect and to really, truly to take a moment right now, write down if you can, or simply gather in your own mind why you invested this time here today with the webinar series and with the topic of good governance. Want to make sure that you do get the information that you're hoping to as we move through this. So would encourage you to prepare yourself for that. And as you are going through that, we'll do some logistics on our brown bag here today. Reminder that all of the attendees will be muted during the call, so should not be any issues there. If you are getting an echo, you may need to switch to a headset or to switch to a telephone call-in if you're doing that through your computer. Sometimes that can be a feedback mechanism or an issue with the built-in computer speakers. Also, if you want to keep me in tune with you as we go through the next time here together, you can use the Interact My Mood function that I believe is at the top of your screen. So with that, you can do that interact and let me know if you're fine, if we need to speed up or slow down as we move through, and we'll do our best to monitor that and stay in touch with you so we can interact together. And also, if you do have a question as we go along, please do use the chat function. That will send a message directly to me, and I will either be able to address that in real time, or we'll incorporate that into the Q&A session that we will have at the end of our webinar today. So those are our logistics. Before we dive into good governance, I'll give you a bit of information on who am I. So I'm Melanie Schmidt with Timpano Group, a strategy consultant who enjoys going in to help organizations move beyond business as usual. That opportunity to help organizations and leaders figure out where they want to go, how they're going to get there, and how they're going to talk about it. So along with that, I'm a certified governance trainer through BoardSource, which is a national organization dedicated to nonprofit governance, and have had the opportunity to go through their training, become certified, and help to spread the good news about good governance. And along with that, knowing that governance is a lot of process, a lot of improvement. Also have a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt to bring to the mix, and continue to use that as ways to help people find visual ways to identify issues and to improve their situations and their organizations going forward. I do specialize in nonprofits, have had the pleasure and the honor of working with nonprofits for over 20 years now, and really enjoy the nuances that go along specifically with the nonprofit sector and some of that ambiguity that is built in to the nature of the business of nonprofits. And so I've been doing that, as I said, for over 20 years, and also have been serving on boards for that long, if not longer, if you count some of those activities done in way back when, elementary, junior high, all of those sorts of things. But do bring an experience with a variety of different types of boards, also with boards at different points in their life cycle. So have worked with boards that were transforming, trying to revive themselves, have worked with others and served as a board president for an organization that went through a strategic dissolution, and also just organizations in change and transformation. So I have a lot of experience, and we'll look to work that into our conversation here this afternoon. I do also add in that I am an expressive driver with amiably analytic tendencies. And you may wonder what that means. Essentially, when you think about governance, it's a lot about people. And so in order to have good governance and to develop your leadership skills as a nonprofit leader, particularly, it's really important to understand social styles, communication styles, learning styles, all of that. And to remember that while we may lean toward one style in certain situations, for me, example, leaning toward being expressive, so having a people focus and a fast processing orientation, we have all of those styles within us. And so it's understanding those dynamics and working to bring out with your board members and your nonprofit staff and volunteers the best of themselves. And so that will play into our conversation here today. And with that, we're going to go ahead and get started on the content of good governance. To start out, what our objectives are here today, we're going to clarify the language of governance. We'll talk about the evolution of governance, looking at it from both a regulatory as well as a scholarly perspective, which will lead into an exploration of some trends in nonprofit governance. Really important to see how things are changing and how they're staying the same. So we'll look at both of those parts of the equation. And then we'll surface some techniques to enhance board dynamics. That is, after all, what good governance allows us to do. And achieving good governance definitely requires an attention and a cultivation of those board dynamics. So we'll go ahead and look specifically at terms. So when we think about the language of governance, important to start where it all begins, with the dictionary. So we do have govern, which comes out of Latin and Greek roots, to steer. And if you think about the Oxford Dictionary, what it tells us about governance is that to govern is to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of an organization, to control, influence, or regulate. That last portion about controlling, influencing, and regulating, keep that in mind as we move into later in our webinar discussions about the board role. And what you'll see is that that comes out very clearly in the 3 roles for every nonprofit board. So making sure when we think about governance, this is the baseline of what we're discussing. And so I want to start out with a poll. So for those of you in groups, get ready for some group debate on whether you believe governance is a structure or a process. And so we are going to attempt to go ahead and make that happen. And as we go through that process, what we're going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concept of governance coming through from a leadership lens. So that poll should be up right now. If you're not seeing it, feel free to send me a message or to do that interact button. And you should see some of the votes coming in and the percentages going up. So structure or process. And when we think about governance, since this is part of the leadership development webinar series, I want to provide some context in terms of the movement of governance through a leadership lens. So as you're voting, we'll do that. One thing to remember is that particularly with nonprofits, but certainly in any sector, every organization is truly unique. So that means it's going to be at a different place in its process. There's no single model of governance. So it's a very important thing to know because all governing bodies will share a common set of responsibilities, but how that plays out through the work will look very different. And so that's always the opportunity that we have in the sector to learn from one another, to share those experiences and get perspective from others who may be in your same subsector or from a completely different one. And as a leader, it's really important to remember that good governance hinges on board member performance. And what that requires is for management, especially the chief executive, the executive director, president, or CEO, to really understand and respect the governing board's duty to provide that oversight, because how a board organizes itself really matters as much as the sophistication and the experience of board members who are coming in. And so if we think about members of truly high-performing boards, they're asking timely questions, they're strategic in their work, they're moving away from the operational. And over time, what we also see is that those high-performing boards consistently self-correct, and they look for new ways to renew, to create a sense of excitement, revitalization. And when you start to see that boredom and routine, that really means you need to pay attention and see how you can get back to figuring out if that governing process is still working for the organization. So what we saw there in our poll results, overwhelmingly looking at governance as a process. And in fact, that is what is put forward from a governance and certainly for an academic as well as an experiential perspective. Governance is not about the structure, and that is something that we often forget, or we default to looking specifically at a structure and forget that governance is the process. And it's important to retain that focus on the process because of the fact that it is dynamic. When you think about good governance, it is changing, it's adapting, it's thinking about who's in the room, what does the organization need, and how can we work together in the best possible way to make that happen. And so very important to keep that in mind, and good news that everyone here in the webinar today is thinking about it in the right way. So go forth when you talk about it and communicate that with others. Talking now kind of that context in the sector, good governance is evolving constantly. And part of understanding that is knowing what's happened to the sector over the years. So we have here a snapshot from 1950 to 2015, where you can see the proliferation of nonprofits that have occurred, particularly starting around the 1960s. And the interesting thing, when you think about that growth that occurred in the 1960s, when really we started to go to 250,000, 20 years later, 1 million, and in 2015, almost 1.6 million nonprofits registered with the IRS. That bump in the 60s is interesting because it really goes against conventional wisdom at the time, which was saying that essentially a growth of government would lead to more private initiatives and other things being funded. But what it failed to grasp is this interesting concept that really being elaborating on vast bureaucracies and being based in that, we really went to more of an allocation mechanism. And so what that looked to do was delegate implementation of federal programs to state and localities. And that led to encouraging more charitable giving and encouraged more private nonprofit organizations. And so it's an interesting point in history. And I think it's always important to look back to know how to move ahead. And so with that, just seeing that tremendous growth, it will be interesting. We'll talk a bit about regulatory ramifications as well as the topics that have been discovered. We're going to spend a moment now on that 2015 number, the 1.549 million nonprofits. Helpful just to see how they break out. So mostly we do have public charities and other organizations being chambers of commerce, fraternal organizations, and civic leagues. 7% of those registered with the IRS are those private foundations. So as you can see, we are still thinking and talking about the bulk of what we would consider to be those charitable public entities. And when we think about that number and that growth trajectory that we saw going from 50,000 to 1.5 million, with that growth comes regulatory scrutiny. And so there has definitely been a change in how the regulatory bodies have attended to nonprofit organizations. And we're going to step through some of those very quickly here. So in the 1950s, what we saw was a focus really on foundations. And so it was starting to tighten federal surveillance of foundations and specifically ensuring that there were good controls and processes in place for that. And then what we see in the 1960s, when we start to see that proliferation and that growth of more charitable tax-exempt organizations, that's when we start to see the regulatory scrutiny taking a broader pass and looking and gathering more information. There were a number of hearings in the late 1960s that led to a tax reform bill. So what you started to see in the 1970s as a result of that was an increased attention to reporting and accountability requirements. And so there was additional sophistication coming into the sector at this point, and there was a need to ensure that dollars were being used appropriately and that there was appropriate oversight within those organizations. And so we can then continue to jump ahead. When we look at the 80s, we saw, again, more things coming in terms of more organizations, more professionalization of nonprofits, and that ultimately led to a model non-stock corporation statute that really allowed the establishment of nonprofits for any legal purpose. And so what that did was removed some of the restrictions and created more questions, which leads us into the 2000s when we started to see incorporation of more business controls, and that was certainly influenced by Sarbanes-Oxley, and we're continuing to figure out what that is looking like for organizations going forward. And so what you'll see is also the generational changes of how governance and those processes were being handled, additional regulatory scrutiny, and now figuring out, for instance, the role of the Finance Committee and the Audit Committee, and with the processes for a board of providing oversight in those two critical areas, moving more and more to having two separate entities, having a business control situation so that there's an additional check in place. So we're just seeing that, again, continued attention. And also then to flip from the regulatory scrutiny, if you look at that time, one of the fascinating things that we learned from history is that many of the issues that were discussed in the 1920s are being discussed now. It's how we're talking about them that has changed. I also think it's fascinating when you think about the history of governance, particularly in our country. What you see is it really goes back as early as the 1600s. And that is new information for me, continuing to learn myself, continuing to do some digging on that history. Originally had found some references for more of the 1700s and now seeing it going back even further. And there is a movement out there that really talks about governance as something that's been around since the beginning of man. When you think about the processes that we were using to allocate resources within clans or within tribes, it's an interesting way to think about it. So we think about the nonprofit governance and the charitable components of that more specifically. In the 1920s, what you saw was a concern and a lot of writing about the differences in the dynamics of public power versus private power, and determining what should be appropriate separations, how should the community and the directors and trustees, how should that community welfare be interrelated between those two funding sources and support areas. There was a lot of activity in the 20s. One of the interesting things, there was some research and some articles that were done where one of the individuals raised 3 outstanding problems in board management. And this was in 1927. So in 1927, the 3 issues identified were: how shall the necessary funds be raised for the organization? That sounds familiar? Fundraising. What kind of nurse shall the board employ? So this was a healthcare setting. That's ensuring resources, hiring that executive director. And then the third item that was raised in 1927 was, having raised the funds and chosen the technical expert, what else has the board to do? And this goes into organizational responsibilities, many of the same issues that we are discussing today. And so it's really fascinating to see how history can be a guide for the examination of those issues, particularly if you think about how things have moved forward forward. We moved from that public-private power dynamic in the 20s to in the 30s, focusing much more on increasing techniques and the vitality of the organization. So we started to look at harmony within firms, efficiency, things of that nature, such that moving into the 1940s, it continued to pull us into perspectives on managerial professionalism. So this was the effort in educating boards about the roles and responsibilities of businesses and the boards of the corporations, and increasing more discussion about governance issues overall, and in bringing a curiosity into those conversations. And then in the 1960s, what you start to see is what's the introduction of what's called the cross-cutting standards. And in many ways, they look at this as saying that given what was happening with this proliferation and that there were additional complications starting to be introduced, under the circumstances, it really wasn't surprising that much of the attention was framed by efforts to make nonprofits more democratic. So this was starting to stress concerns about responsiveness, about diversity, and about public reporting. And so we started to see a variety of different lenses being used to discuss governance and to work with boards. In the 1970s, what we saw was really a lot of prescription. So this was, there are a lot of generalities that were introduced in the 1970s. So it was the time for a lot of models, a lot of rote systems by which things should be done in order to make the board more efficient and to focus on that. Whereas then when we move into the 80s, we started to talk more about the structures of the nonprofit and really started to also look at, what are the issues of effectiveness, director liability, committee structures? How does one interpret the mission? And again, emerging still is the division of responsibilities between board and staff. And so this was fueled in part by some highly publicized conflicts that were emerging and some of the scandals. We may remember the televangelists. This was about the time some of the concerns about United Way and Covenant House were coming out. And so it was looking at how can we structure the work to mitigate that risk and liability. In the 90s, what we started to see was that shift toward empowerment. And this is where we saw the reflections on responsibilities. How can we empower stakeholders? How can we bring their voice into our process in different ways? So that by the 2000s, we're seeing that focus shift even more to stewardship and empowerment. Once we figured out those responsibilities, identified how to bring the voices in, then how can we empower them and remove the concept of the tokenism? So that by 2010s, and what we're really looking at now, and you'll see this playing out, is an emphasis on engagement and effectiveness. We're starting to see more of a return to people looking for information and education on the core components so that they can engage more people more effectively. Which leads us to thinking about trends. And the trends in the sector right now are looking at shifting structures as a way to improve those processes. So we are seeing fewer standing committees, and that number continues to come down year over year in the research, and that those committees also are having a more functional emphasis, and we're seeing more work groups that are focused on strategic priorities. So it's no longer setting up standing committees year over year for every aspect of operations. It's now looking at fewer committees and more work groups that can really dive in on some of those good strategic discussions. And the work groups allow for people to bring their skills to the table. And that is a huge component of that good governance. And we will continue to talk about that later in our hour here today. You're also seeing more dedicated resources attending to governance within nonprofits. One of the major trends has been the creation of a board development or a governance committee that is a subset of the board focused on improving the efficiency and effectiveness of that board dynamic and everything that goes along with it. So it's no longer taken for granted. It's no longer left to the purview of either the board chair or the chief staff officer. It's now something that's being shared among board members in a very focused way. Another good component for that shifting structure We're seeing less complex bylaws, more common language bylaws, that notion of, since the bylaws really are intended to structure how the nonprofit is operating, they need to be understood. Plain language bylaws that are much less complex, and then allowing the board and the staff to have more policies and procedures that can guide their day-to-day activities or their meeting-to-meeting discussions. This is also helpful because it allows for more flexibility and adaptability at a policy and procedural level without fundamentally changing the operating parameters or the bylaws for the nonprofit itself. Along the line of those shifting structures, we are seeing smaller core governing bodies emerge. So seeing the number of appointed board members slightly coming down, and what we are seeing is the number of advisors going up. And so that's allowing for more focused strategic attention on the direction of the organization and the oversight, and a broader perspective on how the organization will remain relevant and continue to provide value to its community. And with that comes more non-board representation on those work groups. Gone are the days when all committees and work groups were board members and board members only. What you're starting to see now is an opportunity to bring new voices into the process through these more dedicated task forces, planning teams, or work groups. This is another great way to integrate various generations into your organization's volunteer activities, and an opportunity to combine the value that, for instance, millennials bring with their attention to data and analytics with the value that baby boomers, for instance, bring with their vast experience, and that the silents are bringing with their wisdom. So it's a great way to, again, expand perspective. And your processes are also improving when we see a greater staff presence with the board, whether that is the executive team's participation at board meetings, more interaction through volunteer opportunities, or other avenues for board and staff to exchange their strategic value to the organization. And with that, we will remember that the critical component of that is because boards are more than the sum of any individual part. The board really provides an arena for members to come together and discuss issues, opportunities, risks, and work together toward these mutually acceptable outcomes. And so it's not looking at individual board members. The value of the board is the collective. And so ensuring that you're bringing out the best in every individual around that table, and monitoring the dynamics so that you know when you might need to adapt in order to improve that governance process going forward. And those dynamics are critical because good governance hinges on clarity. One of the key components on which you need to be clear is the role of the board. And so there are 3 roles for every board. Harkens back, as we said earlier, to 1927 and the questions that were raised then as well. The board has a responsibility to set that direction, ensure resources, and provide oversight. And with that, at a very strategic level, looking at strategy, understanding 4 different kinds of capital, and then managing and discussing according to the mission and the intentions of the organization. So ensuring that your board is very clear, and that your staff is also clear, and your volunteers are clear on those 3 roles. It can help everyone find their way and provides a framework for discussion when issues or concerns arise. There are also some very specific core responsibilities of members that, for good governance to occur, everyone needs to truly understand these dynamics. So the core responsibilities of members lie within 3 duties: that duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And for those 3 cares that are critical for retaining some of that tax-exempt status that nonprofits do enjoy. And the duty of care is caring for the organization, being prepared, asking questions, understanding the context of the dynamic within which you're working. That duty of loyalty is being loyal to the mission and the organization, ensuring conflicts of interest are disclosed, that when you walk into the meeting, you're loyal to the organization on which you serve, and leaving other allegiances at the door or putting them into a secondary position. And then a duty of obedience really is all about ensuring attention to following policies and procedures, being ethical in your actions, and moving the organization forward appropriately. And those are the legal responsibilities for every board member. A board member also then wears two other hats, that of an ambassador and that of a volunteer. And ensuring clarity around those three hats and setting specific articulated expectations is a really great way to advance the governing of the organization. With that clarity, then people can have much better conversations and become much more comfortable. And it's also important because when you see confusion about board responsibilities, it's limiting the board's ability to be effective in fulfilling its role. It's also creating unnecessary tension between board members and or with the board and the chief executive. And so that clarifying, being clear on those things really helps set the stage appropriately. And one way to think about that is this notion of holding the lines. You know, the board and the staff are part of a whole, and together they're each bringing value into the nonprofit organization. And they each have different responsibilities and roles in the overall functioning of the nonprofit. And so from a board, the value that a board is bringing in is their community perspective. They are there to gather information from the community and provide that outside perspective to the staff as they're working through the day-to-day implementation of the strategy. In the same vein, what the staff are bringing in is that true value of expertise. They are in there day over day learning about the challenges, understanding what's working, what's not working from an operational perspective. And when you hold the lines, that allows each side of that sphere to excel and to remember what it is there for. When you then bring those conversations together and cross-fertilize, you really get a wonderful dynamic that really aids the process and the governing for the organization. And when you think about that, it's a way to think in holding that line and bringing things together. There's a governance as leadership or shared governance. And so a board has a certain set of responsibilities that it needs to do for hiring and assessing the executive director, recruiting board members, setting policy, etc. The executive director has that responsibility, and the staff for hiring and supervising staff, developing policy questions, implementing programs. And together, setting that strategic planning, developing fundraising strategies, doing evaluations, preparing for board meetings. When those two forces come together, it is a wonderfully dynamic and vibrant way to move the organization forward and ensure you're getting relevant and appropriate discussion. And so if you think about that concept of the clarity and putting it into practice, it means understanding how roles and responsibilities play out in your organization. As we said earlier, no two nonprofits are alike. Everything's a little bit different based upon those dynamics. And so while the roles and the responsibilities are in play and very structured, how does that actually work within your nonprofit? As a leader in the organization, you have that responsibility to reflect on that and to really think about it and know when it isn't clear, how can we have a conversation to find that clarity? And so then when you are clear on it and you're bringing new people in, include education about roles and responsibilities in your recruitment process. Don't even wait until their first board meeting or 6 months into their board term. Include that into your recruitment process because your roles and responsibilities and how they play out is different than where they have come from with other experiences. Also important to incorporate these duties as part of an annual review of articulated expectations for board members so that this can be very clear about what are the expectations as an ambassador, as a volunteer, in attending board meetings, in participating, articulating that into a short list. Think in terms of 8 to 10 expectations that all board members should have of each other and of themselves, so that you can also put this into practice by ensuring a shared understanding about those mutual benefits between the board and the staff. When everyone understands the value the other is bringing in, we become much better. The individual excels, and overall, the overall governance becomes much more effective. Another thing about good governance is that it sparks curiosity. With that, we're going to take a moment to think about what is that good board experience. So when we think about a good board experience, it's very experiential. It's very sensory. And so an opportunity that you have, if you have a board governance committee or some folks who are just very interested in improving the dynamic of the board and looking at different processes, you can go through an exercise of the sensory review of your board. And what that means is an opportunity to look at what does the board look like? If you walk in, what does a good board for my organization look like? To say whether that has to do with diversity in terms of ethnicity or perspective, backgrounds. It could be what you look like in terms of the formality or informality of the organization. But for a good board for your organization, what exactly does that look like? And to actually put that down, write it down, draw it out, make a picture, whatever you might need to do there. And then think about, what does a good board sound like? And one of the interesting things that is coming up more and more in research now that has to do not only with boards, but overall organizational dynamics, is that a good organization has laughter. And that is also very true for a good board. If a good board can laugh together, genuinely laugh about good things that are happening, then you know that you have a certain spark in that dynamic. You're talking about things in a way that people are feeling comfortable. So look about, how does it sound like? One of the more unusual exercises to go through is, what does that good board smell like? Now, for some people, it might smell like popcorn, because they want to attend to people's snacking needs during a meeting. It might smell like sunshine on a rainy day or something like that. And what you're doing at that point is really starting to expose some personal interest or vulnerability about the individuals going through the exercise, so you can bond over this unusual process. Another then, of course, moving on in your senses, what does it taste like? What does a good board taste like? And for that, again, it expands and pushes you to think about that governing process in the board experience in a different way. And that's really what it's about, is to just challenge you to think differently. And then, what does a good board feel like? What if someone were to touch it? What would it feel like? Would it feel formal, informal? Would it feel very like stone? Would it feel like sand? Thinking about that very creatively. And it can be fun, it can be challenging, and it can be a great way to push yourself in identifying your current and future state and what those gaps are for a good board experience. And so once you think about that, perhaps a more linear way to think about it, or a structured way, would be to take a grid such as this one that we developed, of what it might look like when things are good, not so good, or kind of bad. And so taking a variety of different ways, the tone, the action, the people, the exchange that happens, the discussions, and the purpose, and look at this and go, all right, so where are we? The tone of our meetings. Are we really feeling like people are inquisitive? They're asking questions. We're very open to things. Are we really kind of digging in, and it's more of an investigation process? How can I find the gotcha? Or is it more of an inquisition, where it's a really much more directional, taking issues and just hammering them home? So for each of these, you can go through and think about, what does our board look like right now? How is that dynamic? And then think about, how can we move things toward the good? For instance, on the discussion line item here, that bad governance process and the bad board meeting is the monologue, which might be the executive director comes in from beginning to end and just shares information, statistics, doesn't really ask for questions. It's much more one-way communication. An improvement moving forward, but still in that not so good, would be those vignettes, where maybe you have an opportunity for a mission moment that feels a bit rehearsed, or you have slight interactions, but again, it's still much more of a slice or a view into the life. Whereas a themed interplay in that discussion is really focusing at a strategic level of how, from beginning to end of this meeting, are our discussions connecting with one another, and are we all engaging in that conversation? So this is another tool that you can use to think about assessing the governance dynamic and your overall board experience. And so when you put that into practice, some of the things, be aware of participation. As developing those leadership skills, really developing that third eye, if you will, where you're looking around as you're participating to see who isn't saying things, who's more concerned about being on their cell phone than engaging in the conversation. And or are you looking at it from every agenda looks the same and we just change the dates? Those get to be very risky behaviors. So just being aware of that. And a way of doing that is to conduct those annual assessments of contribution and satisfaction. And that's for board members, and you can also do that for staff as well. But looking at, how do I feel about my contribution to the organization? Am I contributing at my capacity, or do I have more to give? Am I over contributing? How satisfied am I with that experience? And coming up with an annual tool so that you can really track that over time. Also, as we mentioned earlier, important when you think about the curiosity of good governance, knowing and leveraging strengths of every member. And this is one of those things that, again, speaks specifically to the development of leadership skills within the nonprofit sector. It's not expecting everyone to adapt to you or that they're going to change their way, but knowing what does the organization need? What are the strengths that each person is bringing in? And how can I remember those in that moment of frustration or when I'm wondering why they aren't contributing? And if you aren't able to observe that, it's a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with them. Call them up on the phone, connect over coffee, and just talk about what they want to be contributing to the organization. And part of that leads into emphasizing that mindfulness in the engagement, ensuring that people are open, that they're present, and being a role model for that activity and that expectation of going in without judgment and engaging people in a very intentional and mindful way. So that at the end of the day, putting it into practice is attending to the dynamics with a very strategic approach, so that it's often a long process, takes some time, but it is well worth it at the end of the day. Another thing that is important for good governance is commitment. And with that commitment, it comes to asking people to commit to serving on that board. A quote here having to do with ensuring that people go onto a board because they're interested in the mission. And we cannot be afraid to ask our board members to do more. We simply have to respect them and their decision when they say they can't do something at that moment. Because what we do see, in Linda's observation here mirrors my own, is that board members will resign for the lack of meaningful work. It's rare that they'll resign from being overworked unless they have said that and they haven't been respected by trying to move away from some of the responsibilities. It's also backed up by the research. And the research will say that quality board members will leave because of being the rubber stamping, rose-colored glasses, elephants, fatigue, or misfits. Far and above in the research, it's the rubber stamping that causes them to leave that board and to really label it as ineffective. And we're seeing that changing more and more, as I mentioned earlier, in this current time. What we're focusing on is more about engagement and effectiveness. And so we're seeing improvements there, but good to remember that we need to be diligent in continuing to engage people. And we need to be diligent in continuing to build their trust and building trust among board members. And in doing that, some of the opportunities that we have are really getting to know each other outside of the boardroom. So that is meeting up in between meetings and having a conversation, calling someone when you have a question about something they're working on for the organization, or just getting together and having a cocktail, but sharing some information about yourselves outside of the boardroom. Also, as we just mentioned, honoring your limitations and also respecting the limitations of others, knowing when you need to say no and appreciating when someone else has had the courage to do that for themselves. Because ultimately in building that trust, it's important that you do what you say you're going to do. If you're going to put something out there, particularly if it's a commitment that you're making to staff within an organization, really important to follow through or to be in communication with them when things aren't going as you may have intended. Also important in building trust, as we know, particularly in a board setting, critical to admit our own mistakes and accept when others make them. We are all human. We will all make mistakes. And so it's important to just admit them and own up to them to move that commitment dynamic further through. Also important, and this is critical from a good governance process, is really to surface suspicions. Too often, boards will rely on assumptions. They don't actually dive into what a point of tension may have been, or if there actually is an issue. They'll make an assumption, and then it will just fester. And the problem with that is when we make those assumptions, then we can cause other problems that were clearly not intended. So just being open and having those conversations. Open and honest in intentions and on the issues, and say what you mean and mean what you say. A lot of these have to do with just overall trust building, and it plays out particularly well with board dynamics. And to always go in with good intentions and to think about being helpful but not hurtful. And building this trust is so important because when we think about that commitment, the ethicists have put forward a lot of information. An ethicist, David Smith, has written that boards are far more than the sum of the individual values and the viewpoints of their members. It is true in that boards are arenas in which individual members will work toward mutually accepted outcomes, the quote from earlier. And so board decision making, it is more than just the work of the organization. It has to do with the dynamics and the public values. And the value of your directors and your board members is that when they're serving a dual role as a manager of an internal culture and an external environment, they're just suited to really have these broadly powerful transformative influences on the world. And that is, after all, what drives many of us into our work with nonprofit organizations. And another key component about commitment, particularly going along with the role of setting direction, is making sure that people know what the objectives are and that there's very clear relevance for those objectives and that they are aware of it. And so this goes back to the direction providing purpose that then fuels the processes in play. And so with this, it's a diagram to just demonstrate if you set those long range organizational goals, 3 to 5 years, then look at your short-term goals, that's going to drive two sets of objectives, one for the chief executive and one for the board of directors. And when you think about that, those are going to reflect one another. But it allows the chief executive to have a domain of operational implementation that needs to occur for the long range health of the organization. And it gives the board its work on annual initiatives that it needs to discuss and advance in order to move the mission forward. And so really important to have that clarity of what those objectives are, how they're connected, and then how they're really moving that organization forward. Another component for good governance is that it provides continuity. One thing we know is that board terms tend to turn. So the current average is 3-year terms, and that a typical director can serve 2 consecutive 3-year terms. We are seeing in the research more of a movement for 3-year terms, but there's still that opportunity for changing and shifting as more and more we're seeing people called out of town for new positions or having to step back due to caregiver arrangements or other things. And so with that flux, we need some continuity. And in order to get that, we need to remember that structure is freedom. And it is true. Some of the best creatives will tell you that they are at their best when they know their parameters, when they're given a fence and allowed the opportunity to jump out of it, but then come back in to complete their creative process. And that is the same with good governance. Providing some structure allows for greater clarity, more curiosity, a strong commitment, and a continuity that benefits the organization, and particularly can benefit the executive director and or the staff if you're also seeing turnover in that executive director position. And so with that continuity, we think about some of the discipline systems and the practices that help us do that. And when we have those organizational objectives, when we know what we want to accomplish, accomplish for the organization, we can develop a content calendar. And the content calendar will take the strategic issues, the objectives that you've put forward in your planning process and map it out over the course of the year. And so you can look at what are the issues we need to discuss between now and the next 12 to 18 months and slot them in. And what that allows for is accountability of the board to its original intent. And it also saves some time from that before every board meeting, oh, we have to put that agenda together. You're starting from something that's very intentional. And it can also provide, again, that accountability to check in on what's changing or how are we proceeding with our objectives. And if you have that content calendar to drive those agendas, important that you have purposeful agendas. One of the techniques people will often use is to insert the question to be discussed on the agenda so that there's more context. So for instance, if you are thinking about need to have a discussion with your board about the renewal of a lease, rather than putting lease renewal as the topic on your agenda, you could put the question in there, what are the opportunities and risks with renewing the lease on our facility for 3 years? Yes, it takes up more character count on that agenda, but it helps frame the way people are thinking about the conversation before they step into the meeting. And that's really important. Another aspect of purposeful agendas that's useful from a process perspective is to name the intent of any item on the list. So for instance, identifying, are we going to look for a decision on this item? Are we sharing information about the item, or are we looking for discussion on the item? And putting that right on the agenda so that it's a very purposeful document. Another good discipline system and habit is issue papers. If you think about governance and steering the organization, that also includes having those decisions made. And so for an issue paper, for every decision, the front of that packet of material would include a 1 to 2 page document that identifies what's the issue, why is it an issue, what's the context, what is the recommendation, and who should be contacted for questions. And that last part about who should be contacted for questions is critical because it's an opportunity to help people engage with each other between meetings. If someone has a question about anything in the paper or the supporting materials, they can contact that person in advance of the meeting and work through it or identify it as something for broader board discussion. But it's a great habit to get into. It also helps clarify the intent of whomever is making the recommendation so that they can focus that discussion in the board meeting. Another good system is an organizational dashboard. So something that is very simple, that provides some performance indicators in a 1 to 2 page view. It might have some key statistics or intended outcomes for your programs. It might include some financial metrics such as days of cash on hand or a surplus or deficit compared to budget. It may also include some fund development targets. Perhaps that's the number of new donors you'd like to bring into your organization, or some sort of revenue target that you're looking at. Might also have some human resource components on there in terms of performance evaluations being completed or retention of key employees. And it will include some measures for your board of directors. Often that might include the attendance at board meetings or the target for new board members that you want to bring on by the end of the year. So it's a quick dashboard, visual representation, and then you have your red, yellow, green marks on it so you know we're doing just fine. Look at that. We're running on all cylinders and everything's looking green. Or we might have a yellow come in that we need to pay attention to. And sometimes you'll have those items that have slipped or that aren't going according to plan, and they'll show up as red on your dashboard. And then you know that you need to entertain a discussion about that. Some of the other systems, having an evaluation system for your chief staff officer, your executive director, and something that, again, is not changing year over year, but it's an actual system that involves setting the objectives and the targets, having planned conversations about progress against that, and then documentation as a means to really and truly support the executive director and his or her leadership of the organization. Along with that, having a board assessment process, an opportunity to identify how is the board doing in fulfilling its critical roles and responsibilities, how are board members meeting those expectations, and doing that, having a conversation at least on a semi-annual basis. Again, using a routine instrument so you can track progress over time. And it's a great way to keep governance front and center as a process and as a process to be improved and enhanced over time. Also important to have that succession plan, certainly for the executive leadership. That can also go for board leadership as well, so that you are in a situation where should something happen, your governance is not going to stumble because of a crisis in that sense. And tying it all together, a great governing tool is to have that board handbook, so that since governance is about process, it is a wonderful tool to give someone, here's how it works with our organization. Because again, remember, everything's different, and every organization is different. And so you don't want someone to confuse that. And you can capture all of this information into that handbook in a really effective way. So if we think about putting it into practice, really it's about being clear on where you are and what you need. And so being clear on where you are as an organization, what you need, and who you need on the board. Also remembering that more people does not mean better outcomes. So good governance does not mean necessarily expanding your board member numbers, knowing that effective dialogue starts to diminish after 8 people. So keeping that in mind. Making every addition a milestone. So again, when you're bringing those new board members in, educating them on roles and responsibilities in advance, talking with them about the cultural norms of the organization, that is ensuring you're getting the right people on the bus to evolve your governance in the most effective way possible. And it also is critical then when you're putting it into practice to establish those realistic expectations. What we talked about in the building trust concept, understanding limitations, believing in good intentions, letting go of things so that you can play to strengths over time. And then recalibrating your board meetings so that your board meetings become a reflection of sound governance practices for your organization. And so at this point, really want to open it up. Feel free to go into the chat function and type in what's your governance question, things that you really wanted to learn that you wrote down at the beginning of our session here today. And while you are moving toward that and seizing that opportunity, just a reminder in terms of some of the information out there about good and bad leadership and how that plays out when you think about nonprofit governance overall. There's some information in there about understanding crucial differences between good and bad leadership, and that it's not in the setting, it's not in that specific concept of the board meeting. It's really in the moral imagination, the collective experience, the creativity, and the relationships of the people who are composing that board. And so that's the need to attend to those dynamics in a way that it allows you to improve those processes, identify gaps, and move it forward. So again, encourage anyone, if you have a question that you would like to raise, now is the time to do that. Coming up in seeing those good governance principles, always that reminder of embracing core duties, being clear on roles, focusing on governance as leadership, committing to strong relationships, making sure that those are working relationships and positive, acting in partnership, assessing regularly, recruiting wisely and anticipating succession, and then above all, learning together. That is the core of good governance. When you have the collective learning together, it's your opportunity to move things forward. So upcoming sessions, we have meaningful meetings, promoting productivity, successful strategy, and a whole slew of items. There is more information available on the Timpano website, so timpanoconsulting.com. Also linked to the registration through the Facebook site. And want to thank everyone for joining us on the Brown Bag series here today. It was a pleasure to share some information with you on good governance and encourage you. The webinar will be available for 2 weeks after this, so you should be able to download that. I will send a link out to you within 48 hours, and we can move forward. One of the questions that has come up is whether or not more discipline in this way has scared off people. And in fact, it has. I've had that experience serving on a board, and we've also had that experience as an advisor to nonprofit organizations. But what we find is that it tends to scare off people who perhaps should be scared off. There are certain responsibilities that go along with being a strong board member. And so if they are scared of the discipline or the structure that's in place, you have to ask why. What about it is causing them to be concerned? And then to work through that. For some people, it's just because it's new and you need to help them work through a transition to something that has more structure. For others, it's a fear of the work that may be involved, because certainly setting up these structures takes time, and it does take an investment far and above what a routine board meeting might feel like. But in the end, it's worth it. And you're also making that investment up front, building the system, building the structure, and then allowing it to become much more self-sustaining and editing as opposed to creating. Also thinking about inclusion and retention of client representative board members. Definitely, this is an area where you really need to think about the scope of the work for your organization and how that works. One of the key components when you think about the board member and the client voice is to be clear about whether they might end up feeling like they're the token representative of the clients being served. And might you be better served creating a client advisory team or a client advisory group where you're gathering perspective on very specific issues, so that you can then bring that to the board from more of a policy perspective. If you have a client that is a strong representative and can bring the necessary skills that are needed for the organization, then by all means. But when we think of it as that client representation, need to be careful about what is the intent. So being mindful of that. I often suggest, again, moving more toward a client advisory board or advisory council or other group, so that you can have that voice in a much more structured way. And if you do have additional questions, as our time here is up, I'm happy to stay on the webinar for a while to answer them. But also know you can contact me through email or feel free to give me a call, and I'll be happy to provide any additional context that would be useful. And also encourage you, you will receive a survey for today's webinar, and would love it if you would complete that and provide me with feedback on how to make these webinar presentations more valuable and more effective for your needs. So with that, thank you everyone for participating here today. Go forth, find new ways to build stronger governance and to truly identify your role as a leader in developing those leadership talents to identify the need for good governance and fostering creative ways in which people can become more effective as board members and nonprofit supporters. So go forth, have a great afternoon, and I hope to see you in cyberspace again next month.